Good morning. I'm very delighted to be here and delighted to be invited. Thanks very much. I am the Heritage Officer in South Dublin County Council, and I've got 10 or 15 minutes to give you a whistle-stop tour of the heritage resource in this county. Obviously, it'll just be a skim across the surface, and please feel free afterwards if you wish to contact me through the council. First of all, what is heritage? It means something different to a lot of different people, but the basic definition under the Heritage Act is there. So it's everything that we inherit from our ancestors or from our predecessors, and that includes both built heritage and also our environment, wildlife. Obviously, we don't have seascapes and wrecks in this county. Well, people might argue that one. But our inland waterways, geology, the hard stuff that you can see. But it's more than that as well. There is a lot of cultural heritage involved in that element as well. So we basically break it down into 4 different themes: the natural environment, archaeology, architecture, and the more intangible cultural heritage element. As in my job, I work to the County Heritage Plan, which is a plan that was drawn up in consultation with the public, identifying a range of different projects, different objectives that are to be achieved within a particular time frame. The current plan is up for review at the moment. So we've already gathered quite a lot of information over the last 7-8 years, and it's bringing that forward into the future and how we might change it and use the information that we've gathered. That's where we're looking at. And what I'll do is I'll just go through those 4 different themes quite quickly and just give you a snapshot really of what we have in the county and how we might best use that resource. If we start with the natural heritage, it surprises people sometimes when they see an outline of our county and look at it from an aerial photograph. Almost half of it, if not more than half of it, is actual rural green landscape and mountainscape. I think people have a perception that South Dublin County is the major, built-up areas of Tallaght, Clondalkin, Lucan. Further over to the east, we have Rathfarnham, Terranure, Templeogue, big industrial estates. But looking at it like this, you can see that, as I say, more than half of it is agricultural. We still have quite a lot of arable fields out to the west, hill farming up in the mountains, and then further up in the mountains you've got mountain blanket bog and the reservoirs. We've got the Dodder River here, which is a major green corridor down through the urban environment. We have the water link as well along the Grand Canal, which stretches all the way down to Hazel Hatch at this end. And this end of the county then, we've got the village of Brittis and then the N7. So the county really is made up of a lot of links, both built environment in terms of our roads, the M50, the N4 across the top, but then a lot of natural links too. These corridors linking communities. The Grand Canal in itself links all the way from the Shannon to Dublin City. So it passes through our county in this area, providing a link for wildlife all the way from the Shannon to Dublin City, if they so wish. Within the county itself, we've got the Liffey forms the northern boundary here, and we have a special area amenity order protecting the Liffey Valley as an area of outstanding natural beauty. We've got protected sites up in the Dublin Mountains and in the Glensmore Valley for a range of different habitats and species. We have otter, we have kingfisher, we have red squirrels, we've got rare plants along the Liffey and along the Dodder, and just the beauty of the landscape itself. In a very small space, you can come from the lowlands of the Liffey right up to Kipure and see all across Dublin Bay and all the way across the lowlands of Kildare. So there's a lot on offer there. Next one, oh yeah. Then in terms of our built heritage, the area of South Dublin was the breadbasket. It was the agricultural area for agriculture to feed Dublin City down through the centuries. So as a result of that strong agricultural base, we have a lot of old country estates and agricultural holdings that we can still recognise in the landscape. We also have a very strong industrial heritage along those rivers of the Dodder, the Grafine, the Cammock, and along the Liffey itself, obviously. and the waterway of the Grand Canal, a lot of milling industries, paper mills, corn mills, oil mills would have been established. And again, that brought a lot of industry, and a lot of our architecture would reflect that wealth and that settlement that grew up around those industries and the agriculture. We have an architectural conservation officer in the council who's here today, and Irene has the remit to manage the protection of over 500 of our protected structures in South Dublin County, which is a task in itself. So we have the full range from some of our old county estates to workers' cottages. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button here. To workers' cottages. Again, we have a very strong ecclesiastical heritage in the county. Tala, Saggart, Clondalkin, very strong communities that developed over the centuries around churches and monasteries. But the architecture also is reflected in the smaller stuff that we call street furniture. So you can have railings, gates, pillars, milestones, seats, water troughs, that sort of stuff that people see as their identity and their own local area, something that makes them different to somebody else. We did a survey 2 or 3 years ago with the public, asking them to identify what they saw as being important in their own local area. We're not talking about the big buildings, we're not talking about the protected structures, but the small things. And the biggest element that came through in that survey was people liked the railings, gates, small pillars, you know, the old, even dilapidated railings in some localities. That's what they saw as being an identity in their local area. So those are the sort of things that we have to make sure in development and in planning that we try and protect those as much as we can. Then if we move on to our archaeological heritage, that is, again, this county has been inhabited since the Neolithic times and perhaps before that, but evidence dates to the Neolithic, which is about 5,000 years ago. If you imagine this county 5,000 years ago, it's a very, very different setup. It would have been predominantly wooded and scrub with some open areas. The rivers and streams obviously would have been a source of access into those areas. And on the mountaintops, which would have been open and clear, that is where people buried their dead. That mystical area between the land and the sky was where the big passage tombs across the Dublin Mountains were built. The evidence of our archaeology is through our landscape, and again it's great when you can see these aerial photographs or these LiDAR photographs, because the impressions in the landscape are still there. While it's been used for agriculture or other purposes in the meantime, the signs and the evidence is still there. This one here is the Hellfire Club. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, which is one of the projects we're working on up on top of the Dublin Mountains. And again, because in medieval times and times of, let's say, political strife in this country, the Normans had built their castles all across South Dublin County, because that was the division between the settled land and the wild natives that lived in the mountains. So the Dublin Pale, the Pale Ditch would have run across our county to protect the settled communities from, as I say, the more wild natives in the hills. So evidence of this is all around. Just to look at it from a broader perspective, an archaeological survey we undertook a couple of years ago, looking at how accessible our archaeology is, indicated that while we have monuments scattered all through the county, centres of, let's say, key areas of archaeological interest emerged around Clondalkin, this area here, Ballyman Park, beside the M50. Tala, again, as I say, they were ecclesiastical sites, Newcastle. And then when you go up into the mountains, we've got quite a lot of offering in the mountains. Again, many of them dating to 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago. So there's a huge history of occupation in the county. This slide over here just focuses on the Dublin Mountains itself, stretching all the way into Dún Laoghaire down, because obviously heritage doesn't recognise boundaries. There are boundaries we put on the world ourselves. But in the past, the Dublin Mountains would have been very, very much used by our predecessors. And one of the projects we're looking at is linking all of those sites across the Dublin Mountains with a walkway. The Dublin Mountains Way, which is a walkway, travels up from Tala here, up across the Hellfire Club, over to Braddon and down into Shankill in Dún Laoghaire down. So you can walk all the way across the Dublin Mountains, 44 kilometres. You'd want to be fit, but they do it every year in a big walk in May, I think, every year. And this is the Wicklow Way as well. So we would hope to develop a walkway that will link all the way across the mountains so that people can actually access these archaeological sites and get a view of our predecessors from that. The fourth theme, I suppose, in the work that I do as a heritage officer is more intangible. It's our cultural heritage. It's the stuff that we know we've inherited from our predecessors, but they're not built, they're not functional things that we can look at and touch and see mostly. It's the practices, our expressions, our traditions, the knowledge we've gained from the past. And we transmit these onto our offspring as well and onto the future generations. As the world becomes a more global village, we recognise that a lot of this has been eroded or lost in different communities. And in 2003, the Convention for the Safeguarding of this Intangible Cultural Heritage was established across Europe to encourage local communities to recognise what's important in their own areas, what their culture is, and why that's important to recognise. It's key to our identity and our self of location where we are. It's hard for a lot of people to grasp because they can see a building, they can see an archaeological monument, they can see the landscape, but that other intangible heritage is more difficult to get across. And don't forget what we have today, what our culture is today, and what we're producing today. Our heritage is tomorrow's heritage. What we do today is important for the generations coming after us. But this cultural heritage, it is a response by us to our environment and to how we're living in. So if we live in a harsh, concrete environment, what does that say about us? How can we make that unique to us? And how can we bring that into the future? And the same with our landscape. We have a very, very, very strong link to the land here in Ireland. And most of us are only 2-3 generations perhaps away from the land. So we still have that link to it, and it's very important to us. But the more we become urbanised, how will that change our culture, and how will that change what we leave behind into the future? So in that intangible heritage, we're looking at stuff that you're all very familiar with: music, song, language, storytelling, the creative arts, obviously, social practices, different customs from different parts of the country. We're a very small country, but you know, I'm from Cork, and I had to readjust when I came to Dublin 20 odd years ago because they didn't understand half of my language, half of my slang words, half of the way I phrase my thoughts. So even in 160 miles, you know, there was a big gulf, you know, that we all have to cross. And that's very important, I think, when I try and engage with people in terms of heritage, is to remember that we're all coming from a different perspective. Intangible things like knowing more about the natural world around us, you know, medicinal plants, foraging for food, they're all cultural elements that, you know, it amazes me sometimes when I ask teenagers, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, they've never picked a blackberry in their lives. They've lived 15 and they've never picked a blackberry. They've lost that connection, that cultural link to our past and to the world around us. And that results in isolated individuals as far as I can see. So small things like that can actually have a very, very big impact on people. Some of the cultural heritage projects we're involved in here in the county. We engaged with the Irish Georgian Society a number of years ago and had a traditional building skills event in Rathfarnham Castle, which was great. Again, getting children along to hammer on stone and try a little bit of sculpture was fantastic. There was an experience for them. We have a range of old holy wells that are still very much revered and visited. This one right in the middle of Clondalkin, a built-up area which is very well visited, and people leave votives behind. They hang rags on the tree beside the well. So there's still a very strong tradition alive there. In Clondalkin again, we've got 3 or 4 generations lace making, crochet making, which is something that people wouldn't be very well aware of. So traditional crafts and traditional skills like that still live on, but don't get the profile, I think. And I suppose that's my job. Our industrial heritage, this is a recent publication only launched last week on the paper mills in Saggart, which was established back in the 1750s, 1760s. But yet, at a time when Ireland wasn't noted for excellence in its industry on the national scale or on the international scale, this paper mill was the biggest employer in both Britain and Ireland at the time, and won international medals for its excellence. So we have a lot to be proud of, and we have a lot to promote. This here is the Glenismall Valley, and this was a lovely project which involved collecting the field names of Glenismall. Again, in our past, we would have known the name of every field and every ditch. They actually had a name. They were given a name by the people who lived there. How else were you able to direct somebody to that field up at the top of the corner or around the back? So they all had names. And as we become more, I suppose, metropolitan here in Dublin, that tradition has been lost. Apart from this area of Glenismall, where there was one family up here, the Lees, who have been very interested in their heritage down through their generations. Pat had been collecting these names and writing them down for the last couple of years, and came to me and says, "What am I going to do with it? It's all going around in my head." So I got somebody to help with him, and he put it all down on paper. They drew the maps, they put the names on the maps, they put numbers on the maps, and they were able to link those fields right back to the 17th, 18th century, where they had, where again all of these areas would have been taxed. So you could trace the generations and the families back. So that was an enormous, not just a cultural heritage one, but a social one. They were able to trace back their own generations who had lived on that plot of land. And you know the way when you're doing something and something just happens, it's synergistic. I got a telephone call, I got an email from a lady in Berkeley in California who was interested to see if anybody could tell her anything about her ancestors who lived up in Glenismall. And I was able to tell her the very area, the very field, the Downs field, which was her ancestors. And there was a photograph I was able to send her of the monument in the graveyard, which is here, which linked her all the way from Berkeley, California, to a little field up in the mountains in South Dublin County. So I think what you might remember is that while you might be doing something small in your own world, it can have huge ripples outside. And in getting that heritage and that cultural message across, I think is important to people. I'll finish off with one project here, which is great for pulling together the 4 strands of the heritage topic that I deal with, both the natural, the architectural, the archaeological, and the cultural. You're all aware of the Hellfire Club, I presume, on the top of the Dublin Mountains here behind us, top of Mount Pellier Hill. A lot of you probably grew up hearing the stories of supernatural happenings and debauchery that did be going on, as they say, up there. The Hellfire Club, it was a hunting lodge that was built by the Speaker Connolly, William Connolly, back in the 1730s. As a hunting lodge, he had a house in Castletown House, and he had bought Rathfarnham Castle as well. So he could stand at the top of the hill and see both of his properties. The story is that this area here is a large passage tomb, which would have had a big, huge cairn of stone standing over it. And when the building was built, they robbed a lot of the stone from the cairn to build the building. And that was where the supernatural stories started. Because, of course, they disturbed the fairies, they disturbed the dead. And within a couple of years, the roof had blown off the building, and of course that was proof. So he returned and replaced the wooden roof with a stone roof. So the building stands to this day. If you've been up there, I mean, it is an experience. I mean, the views over the whole of Dublin and over Kildare is wonderful. They are wonderful, but the building itself is spectacular. But I think a lot of people, when they go up there, don't realise that there are 2 passage tombs. There's this large one here and a smaller one here. right in the middle of which they put the trigonometric point. So that's a much smaller tomb. So we're in the process at the moment of excavating. This was in the first week, and there's another trench going across there at the moment to establish the origins of it, the timing of it, see if we can get something to date from it. They've got some nice, interesting stuff from it already. And if you do have time this week or next week, take a trip up, see the views, see the beautiful building itself, the spooky building that it is now. But it was occupied, well, they believe it was occupied at one stage after Speaker Connolly died by the Dublin Hellfire Club. You're aware of the Hellfire Clubs? They were, well, young, aristocratic, wealthy, young men with nothing else to do but drink and cavort. Sounds familiar. But they used to meet in Cork Street, apparently, in the middle of Dublin City, until their shenanigans got them to be thrown out of that location, and they rented out this building here as a means to get on with enjoying life without being interfered with, let's say. So a lot of the stories we have relate to that whole period in the mid-1700s. About Dean Swift, who actually lived in Sagart quite nearby, described them as a brace of monsters, blasphemers and bacchanalians. As I said, they were young and too much money, and that's what they did. But in 1991, there was a Young Scientist exhibition project undertaken by boys in Terranure College, looking at the folklore and the history of this site. And they, again, did a very interesting cultural heritage project. They went out and they surveyed the people. They stood in shopping centres and libraries and schools and asked people what they knew of the Hellfire Club. And they gathered all of those stories together into a document. And that was the first time that we actually had a written record of some of those local cultural stories. We're now undertaking that again in conjunction with the archaeological excavation. We're working with Tallaght Community School, the transition year students there, and they're going to go out now 25 years later and redo that story and see, has that cultural knowledge changed? Has that community information, that community folklore memory of all of those happenings on the Hellfire Club, has it changed? Has it diminished? Has it been embellished? Do the children still know that if you run around the building 3 times coming up to Halloween, the devil will appear to you? You know, so that's an interesting aside. So one site can offer, you know, an opportunity to examine 4 different elements of our heritage. The landscape, obviously, the natural landscape is spectacular up there. It's surrounded to the south side by Quailton Forestry. And again, people have complained in the past that they used to be able to see this building standing on the top of the mountain until the trees were grown up around it. Things change. So as I say, if you do have an opportunity to go up and see it, do before the end of next week. There are loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of projects that we could tell you more about, but that's just, as I say, just a skimming over the top of the sort of resource that we have here in the county. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks, Aoife.